The last night, the mystery that should never have happened. Chapter 1. The Stranger. It was a bitter, cold evening in the small town of Darby Falls. The kind of night where even the wind seemed to carry whispers of long-buried secrets. Most of the town had already settled in, safe behind their drawn curtains, but not Jack Mathers. Jack, a truck driver with a history of making bad decisions, was driving down the lonely stretch of Route 12, heading towards the town's outskirts. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he fought to stay awake. He had been driving for hours, and his exhaustion was catching up with him. The night had a thick, unsettling darkness, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The radio, which usually kept him company, was filled with static. Frustrated, he slapped it, but nothing worked. That's when he saw the figure, a man, standing by the side of the road, his hand raised in an old-fashioned hitchhiker's pose. Jack slowed the truck down, debating whether to stop. The man was alone, his face hidden by the brim of a wide hat and the shadow of the trees. There was no car around, no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour. But something about the men drew Jack in, like a force he couldn't resist. He pulled the truck to a stop, and the man climbed in without a word. Jack tried to break the silence. "Where you headed?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes gleaming under the brim of the hat. "You shouldn't have picked me up," the man finally said, his voice a low rasp. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Why's that?" The man's smile was thin, barely there. "Because now you're part of it." "Part of what?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. The man's eyes met his. "The night. The last one." Before Jack could respond, the man reached over and turned the radio off completely. The silence that followed was unnerving, more profound than the static had been. Jack gripped the wheel harder, trying to shake off the sense of dread that was creeping over him. Something was definitely wrong. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw it. A figure darting across the road, too fast for him to react. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet pavement. The man beside him didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "What the hell was that?" Jack shouted, his heart racing. But the man only smiled again, this time wider, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. "It's already begun." What did Jack stumble upon? Want to know more? Subscribe and share to find out what happens next in this thrilling mystery. Chapter 2. The Missing Hours. Jack sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding as he stared out the windshield. The figure was gone, vanished into the night as quickly as it had appeared. His hands were trembling, and his mind raced to make sense of what just happened. The man beside him sat calmly, almost as if he expected it. "You need to drive," he said, his voice flat but commanding. I almost hit someone," Jack stammered, still trying to catch his breath. "You didn't," the man said, his voice cool. "But you will if you don't keep moving." Jack's instincts screamed at him to get away, but something stronger, a deep, primal fear, rooted him to the spot. He turned the key in the ignition, and the truck roared back to life. The headlights pierced through the thick darkness, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. The figure was gone. For a moment, silence hung between them like a heavy curtain, but Jack couldn't stand it any longer. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. "And what the hell is going on?" The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn photograph, holding it up for Jack to see. The image was of a young woman, her eyes bright with life, but there was something about the photo that unsettled Jack. Maybe it was the edges, frayed and yellowed, like it had been through too much, just like everything else on this strange night. "She's been missing for a long time," the man said softly, staring at the picture with a strange, lingering sadness. Jack glanced at the photo again, a knot tightening in his stomach. "What does she have to do with me?" The man tucked the picture back into his coat, his eyes hardening. Everything. Jack's skin crawled. The man's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He felt like he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding, something dark and dangerous. His heart raced as he realized that he might be in more trouble than he could imagine. Suddenly, the man leaned forward, his voice a chilling whisper. "You see, Jack, this night? It's not just any night. It's the last night, her last night." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean by the last night?" The man smiled, but it was devoid of any warmth. "You're going to find out. But trust me, you're not going to like the answer." Curious about the dark secret behind this mysterious night? Stay tuned and don't forget to share and subscribe to uncover the chilling truth. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Place. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, its darkness now oppressive, suffocating. Jack drove in silence, his eyes darting nervously from the road to the mun beside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into some kind of nightmare, but this was no dream, this was real. The hitchhiker remained still, his gaze fixed on the road, almost as if he knew exactly where they were headed. Jack didn't dare ask any more questions, but his mind raced. Who was this guy? Why had he been standing out there in the middle of nowhere, waiting to be picked up? And more importantly, what did he mean by the last night? After what felt like hours, the man finally spoke. "Pull over up ahead," he said calmly, pointing to a narrow dirt road that veered off the highway. Jack hesitated but complied. The truck bumped along the dirt path, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires the only thing breaking the eerie silence. The headlights revealed nothing but dense woods on either side of the road. The farther they drove, the more Jack felt like he was being swallowed whole by the darkness. "Stop here," the men commanded. Jack stopped the truck and looked around. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves and earth. There was nothing here. Just a desolate patch of land. "What is this place?" Jack asked, his voice a whisper. The man's expression darkened. "This is where it happened." "Where what happened?" Jack pressed, his anxiety growing by the second. The man leaned forward, his cold eyes locking onto Jack's. "This is where she disappeared. And this is where it's going to end." Before Jack could react, the man opened the door and stepped out into the night. Jack sat frozen for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told him to drive away, to get as far from this place as possible. But something stronger, some inexplicable force, kept him rooted to the spot. Jack slowly climbed out of the truck, his breath visible in the cold air. The man stood a few feet away, staring at the woods, his posture tense, as if he was waiting for something, someone. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to change, growing colder, heavier. Jack's skin prickled, and he realized that the forest had gone deathly quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. Just silence. "I shouldn't be here," Jack muttered, mostly to himself. The man turned to him, his face pale in the moonlight. "You're already part of it. There's no turning back now." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "Part of what? What is this?" The man's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "The curse. It's the same every year. The same night. The same disappearance. And this year, you're here. What lies ahead in the cursed woods? Want to know more? Subscribe and share to uncover the terrifying secrets hiding in the shadows. Chapter 4. The Echoes of the Past. Jack felt his pulse quicken. "A curse," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared into the blackness of the trees, hoping for some kind of rational explanation. But deep down, he knew this night had long stopped being rational. The man turned back toward the forest, his expression unreadable. 20 years ago, she vanished from this exact spot, he said, his voice low and distant, as if recounting an old memory. "We looked for days, weeks, but she was gone, like she'd been swallowed by the earth itself." Jack's skin crawled. "You're talking about the woman in the photo?" The man nodded, his gaze never leaving the dark expanse of trees. "Her name was Emily. She was my sister." Jack took a step back, dread creeping up his spine. "What does that have to do with me?" The man finally turned to face him, his eyes cold and hard. "Because you picked me up. And now, you're part of the night. You're part of the story." Jack shook his head. No, I don't believe in this cursed nonsense. There's got to be a logical explanation." The man's smile was grim. "You'll believe soon enough." Before Jack could respond, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a force that rattled the branches. It felt unnatural, like the wind itself was alive, swirling with an ominous presence. Jack stumbled backward, his eyes darting around, searching for the source of the sudden storm. The man stood perfectly still, his face expressionless as the wind tore at his coat. "It's starting." "What's starting?" Jack shouted over the wind, panic rising in his chest. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the woods. Jack's eyes followed his finger, and what he saw made his blood run cold. At first, it looked like a shadow, a figure moving between the trees, barely visible in the gloom. But as it drew closer, Jack realized it was no trick of the light. A woman, dressed in white, her face obscured by her long, dark hair, was walking toward them. Her movements were slow, almost graceful, but there was something wrong with the way she moved, unnatural, like she wasn't quite touching the ground. Jack's heart raced. What is that?" The man's voice was barely audible over the wind. "That's Emily." Jack backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure stopped just at the edge of the trees, her face still hidden beneath her hair. Jack felt a surge of terror. He wanted to run, to get back in the truck and drive as fast and far as he could, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the earth itself held him in place, forcing him to face the impossible. Emily slowly lifted her head, and Jack caught a glimpse of her face. Pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with something dark, something that wasn't human. Suddenly, the man stepped forward. "Emily," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's me. I'm here." For a brief moment, Jack thought she might respond, that she might break free from whatever had a hold on her. But then her eyes shifted, locking onto Jack with an intensity that made his heart stop. And then, she moved. Who, or what, is Emily? What will Jack do next? Share and subscribe to see the shocking twist unfold in the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. Jack's breath caught in his throat as Emily's lifeless eyes fixed on him, locking him in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but he felt paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the air around him had thickened, making it impossible to move. The man, Emily's brother, stepped toward her, his voice a desperate plea. "Emily, it's me. It's John. Please, come back. This isn't you." But Emily didn't acknowledge him. Her focus remained on Jack, her head tilting slightly, as if studying him. Then, without warning, she lunged forward, faster than any human could move. Jack stumbled back in panic, his mind reeling, but John stepped in front of him, arms outstretched. "Emily, stop!" John shouted, his voice trembling but determined. For a moment, it seemed like Emily hesitated. She stopped inches from John, her body unnaturally still, her head lowered. Jack could see her face more clearly now, pale and drawn, her skin stretched too tight across her bones. Her eyes were wide and empty, as if all the life had been drained from her. "Emily." John's voice softened, thick with emotion. "You don't have to do this. I'm here to help you. We can end this." For a split second, Jack thought he saw something flicker in Emily's expression, recognition, maybe even sorrow. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same hollow stare. She stepped back, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to get out of there. He turned to run, but John grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Wait," John said, his voice urgent. "You can't leave. She'll come after you. She always does." Jack wrenched his arm free, panic rising in his throat. "What the hell are you talking about? What is she? What is this?" John's eyes were dark with fear. "It's the curse. Every year, on this night, Emily returns. And every year, she chooses someone. If you leave now, you'll never escape her." Jack shook his head, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. "This is insane. You're insane." But before he could argue further, Emily let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a scream. It was a sound that made Jack's blood run cold. She took a step forward, her eyes still locked on him, and Jack realized with horrifying clarity that John was right. She was coming for him. "Run!" John shouted, pushing Jack toward the truck. "We have to get out of here." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, he could hear Emily moving, her footsteps unnaturally fast and erratic, like an animal chasing its prey. Jack reached the truck, fumbling with the door in his panic. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get the key into the ignition. "Come on, come on," Jack muttered under his breath, finally managing to start the engine. The truck roared to life just as John flung himself into the passenger seat. "Go!" John shouted, slamming the door shut. Jack floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the truck sped down the dirt road. The headlights cut through the darkness, but Jack's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of Emily. For a moment, all he saw was the blackness of the forest. But then she appeared, running, sprinting after them, her body moving in that unnatural, jerky way that sent a fresh wave of terror through Jack. She was fast, too fast. The truck wasn't going to outrun her. "She's catching up," Jack shouted, his voice shaking. John was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. "Just keep driving. We have to make it to the clearing. That's where it ends." "What clearing?" Jack demanded, glancing at John in confusion. "The place where she disappeared," John said, his voice grim. "It's the only way to stop her." Jack's heart raced as the truck barreled down the narrow road, the trees blurring past them. Emily was still behind them, getting closer with every passing second. Jack could see her now, her face twisted in an expression of rage and hunger. She wasn't going to stop until she had him. Will Jack escape Emily's deadly pursuit? What lies ahead in the mysterious clearing? Stay tuned and share to see the chilling climax unfold. Chapter 6. The Final Night. The truck thundered down the road, the narrow dirt path giving way to rough terrain. Jack could barely keep the vehicle steady as they hurtled through the forest, the truck bouncing over rocks and roots. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, Emily was closer, her face twisted in an expression of pure, inhuman rage. "We're not going to make it," Jack shouted, his voice filled with panic. John shook his head, his face pale but determined. "We will. Just keep going. We're almost there." The road finally opened up into a wide clearing, and Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. The headlights illuminated a vast, empty space surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing, Jack saw something, a crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and dirt, like it hadn't been touched in years. "This is it," John said breathlessly, climbing out of the truck. "This is where it ends." Jack followed him, his heart racing, his body trembling with fear. What do we do? How do we stop her? John didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. Jack stood frozen, watching as John pulled something from his coat, a small, silver locket. He held it up to the sky, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Emily, I'm here. I brought it back. I'm sorry I took it from you." Jack's eyes widened in confusion. "What are you talking about?" John turned to him, his face etched with guilt. "The night she disappeared, we fought. I took this from her. She was wearing it when she vanished." Before Jack could respond, the wind picked up again, swirling around them with unnatural force. The trees groaned, the air thick with a suffocating sense of dread. Jack turned toward the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, she appeared. Emily stepped into the clearing, her movements slow, deliberate. Her eyes were still locked on Jack, her face twisted with fury. But when she saw the locket in John's hand, she stopped, her expression changing. For the first time, Jack saw something other than anger in her eyes: pain. Loss. John stepped forward, holding the locket out to her. "I'm sorry, Emily. I should have given it back. I never meant for any of this to happen." For a long moment, Emily stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the locket. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the silver chain. The moment she took the locket, the wind stopped, and the air grew still. Jack watched in stunned silence as Emily's face softened, the anger fading from her expression. Her body began to dissolve, the edges of her form blurring like mist in the morning sun. In seconds, she was gone, leaving nothing but the faint echo of her presence in the air. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Is it over?" John nodded, his face pale and drawn. "It's over." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by exhaustion. He slumped against the truck, his heart still pounding in his chest. What the hell was that? John didn't answer. He simply stared at the spot where Emily had disappeared, his eyes filled with a sadness that Jack couldn't fully understand. "It's over," John repeated softly, more to himself than to Jack. "But I'll never forget." The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.